Martin. So please give him a big App Promotion Summit USA welcome to the virtual stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Just making sure, can you see my presentation and can you hear me? Hi, James.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, it's all good. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let me kick it off. James, thank you very much for this opportunity for me to share how LinkedIn accelerated our app growth. My name is Martin. I've been with LinkedIn for 1.5 years, and I head up our strategy and business development for mobile growth. Before that, I was at Google for almost 9 years, also heading up the program for app distribution at Google. So the goal for this next half hour we have together is for me to just briefly run you through a maximum of 8 slides and hopefully which shouldn't take longer than about 10 minutes so that we have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. I would love to make this as relevant for you as possible. So with that, let's kick it off. Just a quick icebreaker. It's a tradition I have when I present 2 truths in 1 line. I spilled orange juice on Brad Pitt. True. When I was a student, I had several student jobs, one of which was being a waiter. And Brad's manager started shouting at him. I got nervous and I spilled OJ on him. I moved to San Francisco for work. It's also true. My goal was always to come out here for work because of the opportunity, but also because I'm a surfer. I grew up in Barbados in the Caribbean, learned how to surf there, and San Francisco is probably the best city in the world for both surfing and being able to have a good job. I speak 6 languages. I don't. I speak 5. I'm married to, my wife is from Brazil, from Rio, so I speak Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch. So just as for context, most of you are probably familiar with LinkedIn, but I'd love to just very briefly share our vision and our mission. Our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And our mission is to connect the world's professionals, such as yourselves, to make you more productive and successful. And that's in the core of everything we do. Now, focusing on mobile growth, our main goal is to get all of our members to explore and get more value from the app, which, as you know, you'll have more engagement if people actually log into your app. So I'd love to share LinkedIn's growth story with you. We are a very product-driven organization. Since inception in 2002, we have thought of all sorts of ways to make sure that our members get the most value out of the platform. And when you think about engagement through app, notifications, email, they're very important strategies that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So I won't go into details there. Unless you're interested, then please let me know during the Q&A. Guest strategy is a strategy for us that for those who do not have login credentials, we also want to make sure that they get value out of our platform and potentially feel incentivized to actually sign up and become a member. We also see strong organic growth, partly because of our brand recognition. We are a brand that many people recognize, and also because of the product market fit. We have over 1,000 engineers working on our app, and there's a lot of research being done to make sure that we build features and products that are important for our member base to help them feel more productive and become more successful in their professional lives. Now, the last part is really something that we can zoom into over the next 25 minutes. So boosting app logins, which is the main goal of our strategy and business development team, really comes down to 3 different channels. Search and display ads, which is where the majority of you, I assume, are familiar with, and then App Store optimization. Both of these 2 channels were kicked off only in 2016, so the company is relatively new to accelerating growth through paid efforts. And then the third part is something I'd love to dive into a little deeper, which is Android OEM preload partners. So I'd love to ask you a question. What do you think is the largest growth channel for LinkedIn? The largest growth channel for us is the preload partnerships that we're running. So this is an example from Samsung. This is incredibly helpful for helping LinkedIn grow. We are a Microsoft company. Microsoft and Samsung have a very strong partnership with many different integrations. And that's also how we kicked off our partnership with Samsung. It's not just a preload partnership. There's also additional efforts that we run, but we find a lot of growth through our preload channels. Another partner that we launched right after I joined the team about a year and a half ago is Xiaomi. So since November, we are also preloaded on the majority of Xiaomi smartphones all over the world, except for China. And we're soon launching a partnership with a Japanese smartphone manufacturer, which we're very excited about. So to bring you on that journey, when would preloads supplement ads, which is something hopefully you're asking, in my experience when I present to audience such as yourself, is something you'd like to understand. Typically, it's when you find some form of ad saturation. So for example, when you hit or reach your ROAS tipping point. But it could also be, for the second bullet here, if your ad CPS is just getting too high in certain territories, which means that your ROI is negative or is decreasing to a point where it might be worth exploring some unconventional growth channels like preloads. So one example here is that you could cherry pick a territory. For LinkedIn, an example would be Japan, where traditionally we see very high CPIs. But if you actually partner with a local smartphone manufacturer, you can possibly get a much better deal and grow your app in this market at a much better economics. Then the third bullet would be natural fit with Android. I assume the majority of you have an app that you run on both platforms, both Android and iOS. So Apple doesn't preload any third-party apps, only about 41 of their own apps. But if you have an Android app and it's built specifically for users in emerging markets, then through Android OEM preloads, there's a large probability that you can find some very good growth for much less than typically the typical advertising strategies that you'll find, especially if you have an app that doesn't require lots of data and people might find it expensive to download your app. So for example, in markets like India, some users that shell out around $200 to buy a smartphone, if they go to a store and they don't find some of the most popular apps on that phone, they'll go back and say, I'm sorry, but this phone doesn't work. I'm missing these 10 apps. So in that case, it might be worth it for you to explore Android OEM preloads as well. And then the third bullet for natural fit with Android would be if you know that your Android users' LTVs, lifetime values, actually outperform your iPhone users. So if you look at the world, roughly 60% of Android smartphones are sold through open market. This is any mom and pop shop, could be Amazon, Best Buy, direct to consumer, online, or physical stores. The other 40% of smartphones are sold through carriers. So if you think about preloads, if you want to go the carrier route, my experience, you can best outsource this through partners like Digital Turbine and IronSource. Digital Turbine and IronSource are very strong here in the US. I'm based out of San Francisco, but also in Europe and in India, and they're exploring LATAM. So I find it's better to go to go through these carriers rather than directly negotiating a preload deal with the carrier, because typically if you go direct to the carrier, it's more expensive, more time consuming to manage. And also you might get locked into longer term budget commitments. The benefit of running this through Digital Turbine and IronSource, it's relatively easy to set up, and it's managed very similarly to what you're already familiar with your CPI campaigns. If you're interested in running preloads through Android OEM partnerships, these deals are quite bespoke. Please always feel free to reach out to me over LinkedIn. I'm happy to help you connect. I'm happy to help you connect to some of these Android OEMs and assist you in that process. Typically what you're looking at is six months of negotiation. You will need some form of upfront budget commitment. And then the payment trigger is something you can negotiate. So on the spectrum of what they want, which is just security for revenue, so they'd like you to pay for just the install in the factory. But then if you meet in the middle, typically what happens is that you pay for when a user opens the app for the first time. And you can measure that through your mobile measurement platform and share those reports with the partners so to make sure that you have a payment trigger that could be measured by a third party. But ideally what you really want, and hats off to you if you can negotiate that, but I know it's possible, is to pay the Android OEM for specific action. For example, when someone logs into the app or if they purchase a digital good of some form. The fourth bullet here is that these Android OEMs will share monthly or quarterly preload data in aggregate, which is why it's important for you to use a mobile measurement platform. And we are working at LinkedIn with Singular. They've been a great partner. I'm also hearing a lot of messages from the market, specifically from Android OEMs, that they love working with AppsFlyer. they are familiar with the Android OEM and the preload space. So if you're already working with AppsFlyer, it might be worth kicking off a conversation with them. If you're working with Singular, if you're interested, please let me know. Happy to help you. And then the last point is a bit more technical, but definitely very important. You probably want to preload your app in the data partition, not the system partition. And the reason that this is important, because in my experience, what happens is if you preload your app in the system partition, is that even though users can delete it from their screens, it will always live on the device. It will always take up space. You can effectively not uninstall it from the device. And this can backfire in a way that it will create lots of negative PR for your company, for your app. And that will also affect your app rating in the Google Play Store. And especially with the latest changes, now probably about 6 months ago, those most recent app ratings in the Google Play Store will weigh a little bit more than the aggregate of all those ratings. So that can hurt your organic growth. This is my second to last slide. I would love to run you through what an Android OEM preload deal looks like. So all to the left, this is where you negotiate the different traits like payment trigger, the maximum distribution cap, the rates, and the sell-off period, and which geographies you'd like to be preloaded in. Once you sign the deal, the Android OEM will update their software in the factories, and then a few months later, once they start shipping out these new devices to the market, you can expect to be preloaded on those new devices. So you'll see a steep hockey stick growth curve where you would effectively see how your apps are performing from a preload campaign. Conversion rate from preload to, for example, app login varies greatly depending on the geography, depending on your brand recognition within these markets, and what type of app you have. For example, if you have a gaming app or you have a news app, it could be quite high. If it's more of a niche app, it might be a lot less. So that's also important in terms of how you want to negotiate the payment trigger to make sure that you don't pay too much. Then about 1 year into the deal, typically how these contracts are negotiated is that you can auto-renew for another 1 year term if you're happy with the deal and they are as well. If not, and you'd like to terminate the deal, the sell-off period will kick in. This is typically a period between 6 to 12 months where even though you're no longer in contract, you're still required to pay the Android OEM for whatever that payment trigger is. For example, the first app open, because they've already done the work, they've already preloaded your app in their software, they've already shipped the phone out to market. So there's a lag time between that process and when somebody actually turns on the device for the first time and then opens the app for the first time. I hope that was helpful, and I managed to keep it to almost 10 minutes. So I'd love to make the best use of your time and open up the floor for a Q&A. So let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Martin. That was great. So, I mean, just a follow-up, in terms of it's quite surprising this is such a big channel for you guys. What's the rationale there, the value of having the app preloaded? Do you think pretty much anyone now on LinkedIn would, they'd just be triggered to download the app and use it, in the course of their normal activity? Obviously, that's not the case. What's the value of preloading it?
Love it, James. It's a great question. I think part of it is just brand awareness. So for example, 30 to 40% of those that log into the app might be completely new members. So it's part branding, but it's also part reduction of the friction from our advertising channels, as you can imagine. So for example, in the advertising funnel, there's a large drop off from when someone clicks on the ad to go to the Google Play Store to then download the app onto the device. But if you already preloaded, that friction is completely removed. So it's also a very effective channel to boost your advertising campaigns. It's just important that you work very closely with your data science or finance teams to understand how this would effectively increase the cost of the campaigns combined. And then especially if you are a developer of an app that is typically very popular in emerging markets, preloading is a very effective strategy to get out there. It's typically cheaper than paid advertisements in markets like Brazil or India or Indonesia or Vietnam. And they typically only have the sort of headspace for let's say 20 or 30 apps. I mean, you and I, and most people here on this webinar have roughly 100 apps on their phone. But in emerging markets, it's typically a lot less, partly because the device storage space is a lot less. So I think it's an effective channel. Hopefully that helped answer the question.
Got it. And Jesse is asking, what about smaller apps? What sort of platforms or services? You mentioned a couple of partners you're using can help a smaller app to get preloaded. I don't know how small she means, but.
So if you want to sort of dip your toes into the water just to test out Preload, see how it works for you, Digital Turbine and IronSource are, in my experience, the best partners to work with, just because it's so similar to how you're already running your advertising channels and how you can optimize that. They effectively work on CPI basis, and you can just quickly set up a campaign that you can set a daily cap. And from that moment on, at least you understand per market, what's the conversion rate? How, for example, if you're preloaded on, let's say 100 high-end Samsung devices sold through AT&T in the US, how many of those preloads actually convert into whatever you're measuring, an app login? And then if you have an LTV for that, how much money are you generating from those app logins? And once you have that information, you can extrapolate to other geographies and think about if it's successful for you without many upfront commitments. You can then think about doing preload deals with Android OEMs.
Got it. And a couple of people asking about quality. So yeah, what Nathan's asking in the chat box, what is the quality of this type of traffic? And yeah.
Okay, so the quality really depends a lot on the smartphone manufacturer. So to be candid, Samsung is very high quality. Specifically, if you, with Digital Turbine and IronSource, you can effectively target on high-end devices, so the Galaxy series and the Note series, which have performed very well for us. If you work with a partner like Xiaomi, their MSRP or their retail prices varies greatly. So if you're preloaded on a $1,000 smartphone from Xiaomi sold in Germany, you can get way different performance than a $150 Xiaomi device sold in India, for example. So that's also why if you work with Digital Turbine and IronSource, you can target more effectively. But if you're doing a deal with an Android OEM, typically you're doing it across the entire portfolio of their smartphones, which is why if for you it makes sense to focus on emerging markets. Xiaomi could be a great OEM to work with. They're very savvy. I love working with them. But if you're focused on, for example, a market like Japan, then Sony would probably be the preferred OEM for you to work with, and all of their devices are very high end, so you can expect a lot of performance from those devices. If your market is Africa, then you would most likely want to do a deal with Transsion, because they're sort of the biggest smartphone manufacturer in terms of market share in markets like Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa.
Got it. And someone's commenting, Door, apparently IronSource has a product that allows more sort of age and gender targeting, which lifts the quality. And Michael's asking, well, in general, for a business audience, yeah, I guess a huge part of the app market is more sort of consumer or general consumer market. LinkedIn's type to more of a business market. Where can you find these sort of users?
So if you're looking for business users, I would try to strike up a conversation with Samsung. Samsung doesn't really have a preload program. They really have partners that they work with, and they focus on integrations in order to help them sell more devices and offer a much better experience for their users. So that's really important if you're just focused on business users. If other Android OEMs, which would be helpful, Sony, I think a lot of Sony users are either entrepreneurs or they're very creative types, because obviously their cameras are phenomenal. Their cameras are in most of the world's smartphones. And if you can figure out a way to only preload on high-end devices from Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo that are growing rapidly in markets like Europe, for example, which also have a lot of open market sales channels, you don't only have to buy your device at a certain carrier. That could be very effective. From my understanding, Xiaomi open stores in the Benelux in London, and you could get some good value from those preload deals, especially in addition to the you might at some point sort of saturate your reach, and Preloads could supplement that.
Got it. And Stephen has the obvious question: what about iPhone? Is this channel completely out of the question, or?
Yeah, Stephen, that's a good one. For now, it is. So
Right.
iOS has never participated in preloading anything else but their own apps. This is just my personal forecast. There is a small probability this might change, especially in Europe, because I know the European Commission is looking into some of their practices. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe a year, a couple of years from now, they might open up a program.
Great, and hopefully you can join us again to do a talk on how to access that. We've cut it quite short. We've got a panel after this, and probably need to leave a bit of time to get them kind of on board. Could I ask you? And we got some people with some quite sort of more questions. Martin, is there any chance you'd be able to maybe drop into the app? Our networking platform, and maybe do a post and do a little sort of Q&A in there. I'll get Tala from the team maybe to help you with that. You should have had an invite anyway, but anyone with maybe these more specialist questions, hopefully we can continue the conversation over in the forum.
I'd love that.
That'd be good. I think next time I'm going to definitely leave an hour for these all these sessions, so we've got enough time to keep going on the questions. So yeah, great. And Martin's dropped his email as well. So all that remains to say thank you, Martin, for dropping in and sharing some ideas with us today. It was really great.
Thanks a lot, James.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Good rest.
Okay.